Hi, welcome to Indie Wine Podcast, episode 25. Today we're going to be talking with Kevin Ferguson. Kevin is the grandson of Mario Gemello, the late winemaker of the Gemello Winery, which produced great Cabernets and Zins and Mountain View for half a century, well before the tech boom of the past 40 years, and back when this area was still the Valley of the Heart's Delight, and Silicon Valley was a glimmer in the eye. Kevin is writing a book about the winery and his bond with his grandparents. It's called Rain on the Montebello Ridge, a memoir about health, aging, and winemaking. Before we hear from Kevin, let's have a brief history of Gemello Winery in case you aren't familiar with it. In 1912, Kevin's great-grandfather John immigrated to the U.S. from Piedmont, Italy, ending up in San Jose, California. About 1917, he buys property in Mountain View. Mountain View's at the base of the Santa Cruz Mountains. The property contains orchards and a vineyard, but he sells this before Prohibition starts and concentrates on selling vegetables door to door from his truck. As soon as Prohibition ends, Gemello Winery starts. It's located right off El Camino Road. Mario was helping out at the winery. He's 17. In 1944, Mario takes over from John, successfully running the winery until eventually selling it in 1982. During this period, they transformed from a winery selling mostly demijohns of 5 gallons or barrels of 10, 20, even 50 gallons right out of the front of the winery. Until the 40s, it was only red wine and two types, Burgundy and Claret. Burgundy used the Zinfandel and Claret used the Mataro and Carignan. During the late 1940s, they moved to bottling in 1-gallon jugs. After World War II, the winery made a historic purchase of late 30s and early 40s vintages of Cabernet and Bordeaux blends from Rixford's La Cuesta winery. Some of these vintages were blended with the Gemello's own grapes, and others sold out of the front of the winery with a In Bond sticker on the front of the bottle. It wasn't until 1956 that they labeled a varietal wine from Gaspar Vineyard near Saratoga. It was Cabernet Sauvignon. And 1960 was their first time vintage dating a wine, and with the classic label. In 1959 and 60, they purchased grapes from Dave Bennion of Ridge before Ridge started making wine. Both Mario and Paul Draper mentioned this in oral histories that they did. Draper saying that it was an advantage for Bennion and the Ridge founders that they could taste wines made from the grapes on their property before they started producing. We'll hear some more about Ridge in our interview with Kevin. In 1982, Mario sold to the Obister family, Kevin's cousins. Mario passed away in 2005, but even today, Gemello wines continue to win tastings and become wines of the night. 1960 to 1970 vintages seem to be generally holding strong and drinking great if you can find a bottle. And if you do, shoot me an email. Okay, let's get to Kevin. Here we go. So Kevin, what was the inspiration to start writing Rain on the Montebello Ridge?
The inspiration was I was a reporter in Las Vegas, and my grandfather got diagnosed with prostate cancer, and that triggered my inspiration to move back to the Bay Area, and I wanted to be around him for the last couple of years. And he had, he was a locally famous winemaker in Mountain View, and he had a lot of great stories, and I wanted to document those stories. I started to meet with him pretty much on a weekly basis, almost every Sunday, and we would go through some cassette tapes that my great-grandfather, John Gemello, had recorded back in the 1970s when he was in his 90s, and he was living with my cousins, the Obisters, who ran the Obister Winery in Half Moon Bay. And my great-grandfather had many stories that he had told over and over and over. And so they figured, we better get these stories on tape. So I met with my grandfather pretty much weekly. Sometimes we'd talk about, his own stories, but we would go through the cassette tapes and listen to the old days of my great-grandfather immigrating from Piedmont, Italy, and then his early days at Almaden Vineyards in San Jose. It was in San Jose at the time. And then some of the things that he had to endure during Prohibition. And actually, what was on the cassette tapes, it ended in 1916. And but a number of the stories were documented in written form that my grandfather and I would go through.
Okay, so your great grandfather wrote them out also?
My grandfather wrote those out.
Your grandfather.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mario.
Was he familiar with many of the stories that were on the tapes?
He was.
Okay.
And he was excited about this project. He thought the project was going to be all about his father. And I was thinking, whoa, no, you're too modest. You're a big part of this story. Mm-hmm. He ran the Gemello Winery for 50 years, for nearly 50 years. And he helped his father launch the winery when he was 17 years old in 1934. And he was still in high school. Mm-hmm. So, which I think we'll get to more of that later in this interview.
Yeah, what was the impetus for the name of the book?
So the Rain on Montebello Ridge, Rain on the Montebello Ridge, came from one of our favorite stories on the cassette tape. Mm-hmm. And my great-grandfather, he told the story of when he moved into a ranch-style house behind Becchetti Winery, and that was at the base of Montebello Road in Cupertino. And my grandfather and I would listen to this cassette tape. My great-grandfather had a heavy Italian accent, so I couldn't really understand half of what he was saying. Mm-hmm. So we would listen to the tape, we would pause it, and then my grandfather would translate it to me as I would type it into my computer. And this one story he told was when he agreed to rent this ranch-style house on Montebello Road. And my grandfather, he stopped the tape and he said, well, the guy was going to rent it to another guy, but there was poison oak all over the place, and he decided not to rent it.
Okay.
And so my great-grandfather said, I'll rent it. And so my grandfather said, you know what? You don't have to put all that. Just put that they moved in on New Year's Eve, 1915. And I said, I think, those details are probably pretty trivial too, So I just went ahead and jotted down that date that they moved in on New Year's Eve, 1915. And then my grandfather continued to listen to the tapes. And then he actually paused it and he goes, one other thing that he said, it's probably pretty trivial. He said it rained for 4 days. I don't think you need to put that either. Just put that they moved in on New Year's Eve, 1915. I said, okay. So we went on continuing listening to the tapes. And then after a second, I stopped the tape and I said, wait a second. I think those details are important. And he said, well, what do you mean? I go, well, think about it. They moved in on New Year's Eve, 1915, and it rained for 4 days. 8 months and 27 days later, you were born. So I said, okay, well, that's going to have to be, that's a key part of the book, and that might have to be the title of the book.
Yeah, that's a good story.
So my grandfather, that was in 2002 when we discovered that story. Okay. My grandfather held on. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer, or a reemergence of prostate cancer.
Okay.
And he hung on for about 3 more years. He died in 2005. But during those 3 years, he probably told that story about 50 times, maybe more.
It sounds like he was a storyteller, huh?
Absolutely. He loved to tell stories. He was not only a jack of all trades, but he was also the life of the party. He was president of all his social clubs, from the Kiwanis Club to the Santa Clara County Wine Growers Association, the Elks Club. And I think a lot of times he was president of these clubs so that he could hold court at all the luncheons and tell his jokes and tell his stories.
Yeah. Any other favorite anecdotes that he liked to tell over and over?
Oh, so many. Actually, there's one story that just came to light. I mean, among my mom and two uncles. So, Mario, my grandfather, he had, 3 children. And these are stories that, they told over and over again. But one of the stories that I recently heard, that in 1956, my grandfather he was one of the few winemakers that had 3 different licenses. He had a wine bond.
Oh, right. They used to sell wine in bond from the winery.
Exactly.
I think, right? They used to sell like
right.
5-gallon and 10-gallon
barrels
and
right.
demijohns and
exactly. And so he also had a license for his retail shop, and then he had a license for I think it was just a regular wine liquor.
Okay.
Wine license. But that became a little bit too much for him to manage. And so in 1956, he took on a partner, Louis Sarto, and his brother, I think his name was Boise. And they ran the liquor store. And I think in 1958, at least the story that I was told, my Uncle John, who was 12 years old, would sometimes come in a liquor store looking for work. And Louis was, marveling at one of his new machine that he had. And it's one of those old machines, of course, now, that, he would feed it wax paper, and then it would, print, and it would take a while for the ink to dry.
Okay.
And Louis had kind of revolutionized the liquor store. A lot of, VIP customers would come in. They say, we're having a party. And Louis would say, oh, you probably not only need wine, but do you need glasses? Do you need, so it's like, if you go to Bevmo and they have it's all prepared for that. Well, that's what he started to do back in the 50s.
Okay.
So these VIP customers, he had more than 4,000 customers, but some of them were like constantly buying, for these parties. And so he would just like invoice them at the end of the month.
Mm-hmm.
So one time John was in there, he was like about 12 years old, and Louis said, you're good with numbers. Here, take these receipts and calculate them, and then send out invoices. And he had the envelopes ready. So he mailed them out. Mm-hmm. And prior to that, as the story goes, they would just come in at the end of the month, and he would just hand them the invoice.
Okay.
Well, when he mailed them out, John mailed them out, and he started to get some angry phone calls.
Yeah. Oh.
These angry phone calls were because the wives learned how much money they were spending. One day they bought a couple of bottles of wine. Another day they bought maybe a demijohn, and so one guy said, "Don't ever send these invoices to the house. I'll come and get them."
Yeah.
So at the end of the month, the next time around, when John came in to do some work, and he was given the list of people to be invoiced, and if they had an X next to it, those were people that were not going to get invoices until they walked into the store later.
Yeah. So, well, you had mentioned 2002 was when you were listening through all the tapes, but there was some other big news in 2002, right?
Absolutely. So my grandfather had retired. He had run the winery for 48 years when he retired in 1982 and sold it to my cousins, the Oberster. And one of the things that my grandfather was, very passionate about was his garden. Mm-hmm. And that's where he was in his garden one day when he got an unexpected phone call, and it happened to be somebody from Wine and Spirits magazine. And my grandfather was, he's one person who loved to talk, and especially loved to talk about wine. He said, "Sure, what would you like to talk about?" And he goes, "Well, have you ever heard of the Judgment of Paris?" And my grandfather said, "Of course." Judgment of Paris was the famous wine tasting in 1976 that really put California wines on the map. Stephen Spurrier, who had a wine shop in Paris, put together this blind tasting, comparing 7 California wines against 7 French darlings of the industry. And to everybody's surprise, 2 Napa Valley wines ended up winning that tasting. And it was written up in Time magazine, and it became, the California wines need to be looked at more seriously. Mm-hmm. And so the Wine and Spirits reporter on the phone that one day in 2002 informed my grandfather that they reenacted that wine tasting for the 25th anniversary of that special tasting of Judgment in Paris. My grandfather's ears perked up, and he said, "Wow, I wonder, maybe one of my friends won, and they want to hear from it, what he thought about it." And it turns out another California wine happened to win the tasting, but it wasn't a wine from Napa, but it was a wine from Mountain View. And it happened to be the 1970 Gemello Cabernet that not only won the tasting, it nearly swept the blind tasting. 14 out of the 16 judges picked the Gemello Cabernet 1970 as the number 1 tasting in the blind tasting. And that just, marveled. My grandfather was blown away. He had no idea that it was even entered in the contest. And that was a story, that was something that my grandfather, one of his most memorable moments of his life.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And that's another story that he told over and over again in his last 3 years. And in 2005, I was sitting with him at the Mountain View El Camino Hospital when he was going through his last radiation treatment for prostate cancer. And he asked me to bring him that article. He wanted to read it one last time.
Wow. Yeah. I was reading about that wine where Mario was saying they got the grapes from, which was off of Pierce Road in Saratoga, and planted by Martin Ray right outside the Palmason winery. And it sounds like it's not that vineyard.
No, I'm sure it's
homes now. Yeah. I think, but yeah, I'm sure he told that story every chance he got.
Yeah, he had. It's one of the most fascinating aspects of the Gemello winery and where it was. My great-grandfather bought the land in 1925 because he felt that this was going to be a great location for a winery. And he, nobody, who would have thought that this is going to be Silicon Valley.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a long time before Silicon Valley.
Right.
And
so in the 1930s is, I think, when Moffett Field became a government project that was going to lead to a lot of jobs.
Mm-hmm.
This is the Great Depression. And so my great-grandfather actually planted 8 acres of Zinfandel in the 1920s because he learned of a loophole in the Prohibition law that allowed for 200 gallons of wine to be produced for home use.
Yeah.
And which is crazy if you think about it. For home use, 200 gallons a year is producing 3 bottles of wine a day, every day. And so you have to be a huge family to consume that much, or just a really drunken family.
Yeah.
So my grandfather he started to, he planted those grapes, and in 1928, 1929 is when the first harvest came.
Okay.
And so he started, the process of making wine. But then in the stock market crashed, and in 1930 there was a massive freeze that swept across Mountain View.
Okay.
And wiped out the 1930 crop of Gemello wine, Gemello grapes.
Mm-hmm.
So my great-grandfather went to his bank. It was the Bank of Italy in Mountain View, just on Castro Street, which many people might be familiar with in that area, might be familiar with that bank. It's 1 or 2 years later, it got rebranded as Bank of America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But in 1930, it was Bank of Italy, and it was one of those banks that it catered, of course, to the Italians. Mm-hmm. The hours were posted in Italian and in English, so that they can cater to those. It was A.P. Giannini who started the bank, who was from San Jose, and then he launched the bank also in San Francisco, and then the Castro Street Bank in Mountain View. And my grandfather went there to get enough money to live on that year, and then also to buy a new tractor.
Okay.
And then, he had to be creative during these Prohibition times. He would use the tractor for his vegetable business during the day, and then rent it out to other people in the evenings for extra cash.
Okay.
And then around I guess, I don't know, it was 1931 or 32, he caught wind that, that they were going to end Prohibition. Franklin Roosevelt became president, and the New Deal was ushered in. And right around that time, my great-grandfather, John Gemello, started to design plans for his dream of having a winery in California, designed the plans for it. And, December of 33 is when the 21st Amendment passed, and they were open for business January of 1934, ready to go.
So it switched from vegetable peddler to winery owner. How were those first couple years of the winery? It sounds like they kind of hit it at the right time, being open the day after Prohibition ended. But was it still a struggle making it at that time?
It took probably until 1937 when they made the full switch to spending 100% of their time on the winery. They continued to run their vegetable business. Half the time they were running the vegetable business, and then the other half they were producing the wine. He had John Gemello had I think that first year they produced just under 4,000 gallons of wine. Most of it was red Zinfandel. And I think there was a little bit that was something called Maestro or Matro that I'm not too familiar with.
Oh, well, I read a thing that they used to bottle a Burgundy and a Claret style.
Okay.
And the the Zinfandel would go into the Burgundy, and then Mataro and Carignan would make up the Claret blend.
That makes sense.
It was a little bit lighter wine, and that was, I think, the era when they were selling it out of the 5-gallon and 10-gallon.
Right.
Is when they had those kind of available. I'm sure that was a interesting time to get into the wine business, coming straight out of the Depression.
Yeah, absolutely. So they had eventually, I think they expanded the vineyard, and they produced 18 acres of Zinfandel throughout the 30s. And but then as Mountain View was starting to grow, I think they had maybe 3,600 residents. And then by 1940, it got up to, I think it was 3,300 residents in 1930, and then up to almost 4,000 residents by the end of 1940 or the end of 1930.
Okay.
So it's about a 20% growth. And my great-grandfather ended up selling off the vineyard because he figured pretty much an economic decision. It was still the Great Depression, and there was a need for it with the Moffett Field, jobs at Moffett Field.
Okay.
And he was able to get his grapes from other vineyards in the area in Saratoga and Los Gatos and so forth.
Yeah, it seemed like they started sourcing a lot of areas that are still producing really great wine grapes, like some of the Santa Cruz Mountains in Saratoga,
right?
Some from Los Altos Hills, I think maybe they were getting some from at the time. Was it like a full family business? Other family members involved also, or?
So in the 1930s, it was my great-grandfather John Gemello and my grandfather Mario did the winemaking, and then Nani, my great-grandmother, did the bookkeeping.
Okay.
And we have these little, I mean, she kept it in this little diary-size book of the sales. You know, one day it would be like one demijohn of a 5-gallon, and then a day or two later, a 10-gallon barrel would be sold. And then in 35 or 36, it was a lot more consistent.
Okay.
But yeah, so in 1934, I believe my great-grandfather John Gemello and his son Mario, who was 17 at the time, they produced just under 4,000 gallons of wine. And when my grandfather Mario was at full capacity, eventually, in the 70s and early 80s, he was producing up to 80,000 gallons of wine.
Okay.
And he had more than 4,000 regular customers that he sold pretty much all his wine at his own liquor store on the property.
Yeah,
and he knew all the names. He knew all his customers by name.
Yeah, that's one of the things I read in the interview with him, is that they didn't really do much distribution at that time. It was almost all out of the winery.
Yep. As my grandfather Mario took over the business in 1941. He was 25 years old. John Gemello, my great-grandfather, continued to help, but he was not the head of it.
Okay.
And so, he would advise my grandfather, but at 25, Mario took over the business. And as far as my uncles and my mom, my uncle John, did some work, when he was home for, through, grade school and high school. And, occasionally my uncle Mark would help out as well. But they went on, for their own careers and economics. My grandfather, or John Gemello, my uncle, became the provost of San Francisco State.
Okay.
And Mark is he works also in numbers. He's a COO of a company.
Okay. So, well, you've mentioned a couple names like the Piketty Winery and sort of early Montebello Ridge. And did they have any interaction with like the founders of Ridge Winery, who end up kind of taking over a lot of those older vineyards in that area?
Yeah, that's a fascinating story as well. So in the mid-1950s, Dr. Benyon, who was one of the founders of Ridge Wine, and his 2 or 3 partners who became his partners in the Ridge Wine, came to visit my grandfather at the Gemello Winery to get some advice on starting a winery. They were still working at the Stanford Research Institute, but as plans to go into the wine business, I'm not sure if they had purchased the land, but they were maybe in the process of purchasing William Short's vineyard on Montebello Road. And my grandfather kind of tried to discourage them.
Oh, right.
From going. Well, he just said, I work 7 days a week. It's a lot of hard work. I wouldn't recommend it.
Okay.
And they ignored his advice, and they not only went into the business, but my grandfather became a customer, buying. I think he bought maybe a number of grapes from in 1959.
Okay.
For I think he got his some of his Red Zinfandel for the 1959 harvest.
Okay. Well, the wine world is probably glad they didn't listen to him.
Right.
What year did your great-grandfather John come to the U.S.?
So he came in 1912, and it's actually a fascinating. His history is really fascinating. He was born and raised in Piedmont, Italy, the Northern Alps, and at age 13, he was being taught to be a jack of all trades. He was pruning a vineyard at 13. He was also running a team of oxen. In the early 20s, in his early 20s, he was working at Martini and Rossi vineyards, which many people may be familiar with their brand of vermouth. And in the evenings, he would tend to his own vineyard, and he would get frustrated that the Piedmont winters would wipe out his crops.
Okay.
And 3 out of 4 years that would happen. And meanwhile, he would be getting letters from his friends in California, many of them Piedmont natives, who would write him letters telling him that he should get out of Italy. It's you're making 10 cents a day in Italy, and we're making $1 a day. Come join us. And so he finally did. In 1912, probably around in December, he boarded a ship in the Adriatic Sea and arrived in Santa Clara Valley in around Christmas time.
Okay.
And then he ended up getting a job at Almaden Vineyards, which was in San Jose at the time.
Okay.
South San Jose. And, he would prune their vineyards and sometimes run wine up to San Francisco in a horse-drawn wagon.
Okay.
And one of those days, he did a big project with his crew at Almaden Vineyards, and he was hanging out, for to celebrate. They went to the Costa Hotel in San Jose to celebrate, and that's where a lot of Italian immigrants would hang out and play cards. And that's where he ran into Giovanni Beltramo, which he was really familiar with the Beltramo family in Piedmont. Giovanni Beltramo had heard that John Gemello was coming, but they hadn't run into each other until they were at the card table at Costa Hotel. And he said, I had no idea you were in town already. And he said, yeah, I just arrived, and but I had to leave my daughter and my wife back in Italy until I had enough money to send for them. And Beltramo came in 1880, and he was probably about 53 at the time. My great-grandfather, John Gemello, was 30. Okay. And since he probably knew what it was like coming to a new land and not having the money for what he needed, he took empathy on my great-grandfather, and he loaned him $190 for a first-class ticket for my great-grandmother and my great aunt to come and join him. Okay. And that's amazing. $190 ticket in today's dollars is probably over $6,000.
Yeah, that sounds like a considerable amount. Yeah. In that era. Yeah, Beltramo seemed like a kind of a man about town, or he'd been there and made a really good name for himself in the vineyards in San Jose in that area.
A lot of people in the San Francisco Peninsula may be familiar with the Beltramo wine and liquor store that was on El Camino for 116 years. It started with Giovanni Beltramo launching it as a offshoot of his own winery. Okay. And then it was carried on through multiple generations, and the liquor store ended up closing wine and spirits ended up closing in 2016. Okay. When two brothers who were running it, they were I think they were approaching their 80th birthday or around that time. And so they decided to close it and sell it. Okay. But it's pretty crazy to think that wine and spirits, the Beltramo wine and spirits, carried on for 116 years.
Yeah, that's a pretty amazing, especially in California terms. I mean, it's most of the time that California has been a state. During Prohibition, how did they earn a living when they were planting those vineyards? Was it just the peddling of vegetables?
Yeah. So in 1920, I think it was 1919, my great grandfather had he had a vineyard up on Montebello Road, and he had it for a couple of years, and he sold it in 1919. I think he made about $9,000, which would account to about little over $100,000 today. Okay, maybe a little bit more with the way that inflation in the past year or two. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't want to go into. He didn't want to be a bootlegger, and so he wanted to take advantage of the technology of the day, which was cars. Okay. In 1920. And so he invested, along with a couple of other friends, in a truck farm. And they would use these trucks to deliver, they called it peddling door-to-door groceries, but or vegetables. And but if you think of Mountain View, which now has 81,000 residents, back then there were only 2,000 residents, and there were orchards in between every house. And so you needed trucks to deliver these vegetables door to door.
Yeah, it's 10-acre plots,
Right,
not
exactly.
quarter-acre plots.
So that's what he did for throughout Prohibition, and probably around 1925-ish is when they discovered the loophole in the Prohibition law that allowed them to start producing their own wine.
So you have some chapters of the book posted on a Substack, but I was wondering how the progress of the book is coming along and how that process has been for you, coming from kind of a newspaper and reporting background.
So it's been going along fairly smoothly. I've been publishing maybe a chapter a month online, and it's so I have a newsletter that it's kind of like I just set my own goal of producing a chapter a month.
Okay.
Or something that is that I'm proud enough to publish it. And so that's kind of the goal. I've published probably maybe about 80% of it's done at this point.
Okay.
But, as I publish a chapter, it sometimes leads to other sources of people who have great stories about my grandfather. And so that might lead to additional research and maybe new chapters that need to go in the story in the book. So, it's never a concrete that 80% is done and then one chapter is done and I'm closer to being complete. So but it's been a great process because, I started the bulk of it in the during the start of the pandemic when we had to lay off. My grandmother is still alive. She's 102. And when we had to lay off her caregiver when she was 99 because of the start of the pandemic, we tried to shrink her bubble. And so I helped along with my mom spending kind of caregiving duties, several hours a day. I would hang out with her and go through the old newspaper clippings, and we would talk about the old stories that would lead to, a lot of the chapters that would eventually get written. And that kind of led to, when I started to launch the Substack, thinking, well, I'll just publish a few of the chapters, and then 2-3 years later, I've got, I don't know how many chapters are published, but probably 15 or 17 chapters are online.
I guess someone with as many stories as it seems like your grandfather had, I'm sure there's threads pop up that you have to just kind of pull on and
absolutely.
And stories probably kind of come from unexpected places sometimes.
Absolutely. Especially with, I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago at the Mountain View Historical Association, and a number of people showed up that my grandfather retired in 1982. The winery officially closed in 1990, and there were a number of people there who grew up. They were probably children in the 60s and 70s and remembered the winery. And my grandfather didn't really do a lot of advertising.
Okay.
His advertising was his face in the community. My two uncles went to St. Joseph's Grammar School, and somebody on Facebook mentioned when I posted the Gemello logo that they remember how the Gemello winery always donated wine to the annual fashion show.
Oh, okay.
And so, it's interesting how these little stories would come up. People in Facebook groups and other, people in the community who, some of them still live in Mountain View. Others have, kind of moved away, but they're still connected in these Facebook groups. And it's, really fascinating to hear these stories. And I'll mention it to my mom, and that'll trigger more stories.
Yeah.
There's a photo of, I think it's from the early 50s, of the Gemello wine sign that was on El Camino Road.
Okay.
My mom said that she would stand under that sign waiting for the school bus. And it has, an advertise. It's basically, the claret was being sold for a gallon for 35 cents.
Okay. Wow. Have you had a chance to try any of the older bottles? Are they around at all? Is there a secret family stash of them or anything?
So we still have, a number of the bottles, but I think many of them are probably past their prime, I would guess.
Yeah, probably even. I mean, the 1970 even would be another 20 years older than when it won the Judgment of Manhattan.
Yeah. And there's actually some wines. So my grandfather started vintage dating his wine in 1960. Okay. And we have a number of bottles that actually don't have vintage dating. So those are probably from the 50s.
Yeah, I read a story about them buying some grapes from La Cuesta vineyard or buying some finished wines from there to blend into some of their wines that was right after the war, and the vintage for them the wines were a little light and kind of low alcohol. It had been cold, but La Cuesta was selling, who is a kind of a well-known winery in its own right, but they were blending those together and selling them, and Martin Ray would drive down and buy bottles and oh, do you know how great this is? This is great wine that you guys are doing here. So it seemed like, I don't think Martin Ray was the type to give the compliments too easily. So it was probably some well-made wine to get the compliments from him, I think.
Definitely. There is an interesting story when John Gemello, my great-grandfather, was working in Italy and Germany. Before he moved to California, this is another example of his being a jack of all trades. A lot of, in Piedmont in the early 1900s, everything, it was very porous. Those borders were very porous. He would sometimes look for jobs in France, sometimes in Germany. And at a certain period, he was working in France doing, some working for I think he was doing some construction, and he had heard that he could make more money working in mines in Germany.
Okay.
So he headed over to Germany, and he, found the foreman of the mine, and I said, I understand you're looking for a worker. He said, "Do you have any experience?" And he said, "Sure." Which, I think that might have been an exaggeration, but so he goes, "Yeah, I could do this." And so he goes, "Okay." So he hooked him up with another guy who was, had experience, and he monitored what he was doing that day. So he found the spot in the mine that they were going to blow a hole and do some digging. And the guy looked at my great-grandfather, John, and said, so I think I'm going to use 4 sticks of dynamite.
Okay.
And John looked at him and he said, yeah, that's about what I would do.
Yeah.
And poof, they blew a hole in the mountain, and it was, good drilling. So the next day, John was told to, take on his own part of the mine and, show us what you can do. And so he said, okay, well, he decided he was going to use 26 dynamite.
Okay.
At least this is the story that he told. Yeah. And, he didn't want to be undone by this guy. So he stuck 20 sticks of dynamite into the mine and poof, blew a hole in the mountain. And it was successful drilling.
Okay.
And the way he would tell the story later is that, a lot of times you stick the dynamite in and it doesn't necessarily lead to successful drilling, or it doesn't blow up.
Okay.
And but he was more lucky than good.
Okay.
And that's how it always worked out for him. But his wife, my great-grandmother, Teresa, didn't really like him working in the mines. And when he was struggling in Piedmont with, the harsh winters destroying his crops, he was debating whether or not to go back and work in the mines in Germany or in France, because he would only be, 1 or 2 hours away. At the time, he had a daughter.
Okay.
And Marguerite had been born. And so he goes, well, if I go to California, then I'm not going to, it's a 2-week boat ride to come back and visit.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So if I go to Germany and work in a mine, I'm only an hour or 2 away. But his wife, my great-grandmother, said, I don't like you working in the mines. Why don't you go to California? And so, and then when you make enough money, you could send for us.
Any idea how they chose California as?
Yeah, so he had friends from Piedmont who had moved out to California, Santa Clara Valley.
Okay.
And it was pretty well known, or at least it was being advertised, that California had this, the same kind of weather. The topography was similar for winemakers in California as it is in Italy. And so that was very common for people in Piedmont and other parts of Italy to come to California.
Yeah, a lot of northern Italian immigration to Santa Clara and Sonoma Valley.
The Gallo family, I believe they're from Piedmont as well.
Okay. Yeah, and there's Italian Swiss colony,
right?
Also Asti, and Sonoma, and yeah, I guess once they got word of the climate,
right,
and everything, probably seemed like a natural place to go.
I mean, I would suspect that they were struggling in Italy. I would think that, because it's not like you're getting on a phone call or watching TV and seeing, oh wow, that's a beautiful place to come. They were sold on pretty much letters that it's better over here than it was in Italy. It was,
well, farming,
wide open land and great opportunities.
Yeah. Farming a vineyard sounds a lot better than working in a mine in Germany, if you can make that work. Where can people follow the progress of the book and read some of the chapters?
So I've been publishing them on my Substack. It's gemello.substack.com. And so I publish early release chapters of the book. I also publish some behind the scenes of the book that may not make it into the book.
Okay.
Interesting stories that are definitely worth sharing, but may not make it in the book. And then there's also updates on speaking engagements and other things related to the research that goes into the book.
Okay. Yeah, I've been following along since I've learned about it, and super interesting. Even some of the behind the scenes stuff. When you had to stop your grandmother from driving and.
Yeah, so that's another piece of the book that when my grandmother was approaching her 100th birthday, and I was spending all this time during the pre-vaccine portion of the pandemic, and I'm researching the winery and the history, and then I started to realize every time I go somewhere with my grandmother, taking her to the store or somewhere, people would be amazed when they find out that she was 100 years old or almost 100 years old. And then it made me realize that this is pretty remarkable that because my great-grandfather or my grandfather, Mario, they had been married together for 64 years. They were grade school. They weren't in the same class, but they've known each other since grade school.
Okay.
And they had been married for 64 years. And when my grandfather passed away in 2005, we kind of assumed that was going to be a very hard thing for my grandmother to hang on. And surprisingly, she has, persevered for 17 years past my grandfather's passing. And so I had to, it made me realize that there's another big story there.
Yeah.
And so part of the book is also about how my grandmother has persevered through 17 years without my grandfather, but also she's part of, the book, the, periods of them being together as well.
Yeah, I think everyone should follow along, and I'm excited to read the finished version once that happens. So,
great. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time today. Really
Absolutely.
Appreciate it. Thanks for listening to today's episode with Kevin. The Gemello wines can be almost mythic. Even at its height, I think we figured out it produced about 8,500 cases a year, and only some of that was varietal and vintage dated. But there was never a huge amount of the wines available. But I hear that when they appear, they can be really magical. Hopefully I'll get to try one someday. You should follow along with Kevin's Substack, and if you're in the Bay Area, he sometimes does speaking engagements also. And in addition to the Substack, you can follow along at Gemello Winery on Instagram. I've read all the chapters available on the Substack, and the book seems like it's coming together great. It really is more than a book about wine, but about family and love and a way of living that doesn't exist in that area anymore. Again, it's gemello.substack.com to follow along with the chapters as they are posted. And the book is Rain on the Montebello Ridge, a memoir about health, aging, and winemaking. You'll be hearing a little more about some of the names mentioned in passing in the episode today, Beltramo especially. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at Indie Wine Podcast. And feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you could tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There's also now a Patreon set up if you feel like supporting the podcast monetarily to hopefully allow for more episodes, more travel, and to help defray other costs. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.